So what does the future of international trade look like? To discuss that, I'm joined again by current affairs commentator Einar Tangen in Beijing. And with us now is CCTV's global economics analyst, Saruhan Hatipoglu. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Rachelle.
So, Saruhan, I'm going to start with you. How do you view China's MES in terms of either helping or hurting this wave of trade protectionism that we're seeing?
Well, this decision on whether to withhold the status from China is certainly going to have an impact and is going to create some kind of a reaction from China. What we're hoping for is that this reaction is going to be limited in nature so that it would not lead to a trade war. With a lot of leadership changes in the country, of course, we're not sure as to where this is going to go. But I think the Chinese leaders are smart enough to look at Europe and the United States and see what has been happening in the region and in this country, which is populist movements taking over. If you look at Europe, for example, Europe is divided on the MES issue. Commission wants it, Parliament rejects it. Germany, UK are okay with it, Southern Periphery doesn't want it. So China sees this and sees this as a weakness that some actually in the European Union want to award this MES status to China.
Right.
But also it's important to mention that only under 2% of trade cases is under AD or anti-dumping regulations. And European Union is the largest or second largest trading partner for China. So are they going to really jeopardize this relationship based on less than 2% of trade? My answer is not. China knows that, and I think European Union knows that too.
Now, Einar, I'd like to bring you in here. We saw that China's Commerce Ministry spokesman says that this failure to grant China's MES is covert protectionism and another double standard applied by the West against China. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the double standard is obviously there. I mean, there's so many parts that go into this, and as was said by my fellow commentator, this is really an issue that is very, very small. We're talking about less than 2% in Europe, less than 7% in the U.S. But you know, the politics of this, as we've seen recently, with the swing toward the right, both in the U.S. and Europe, is very, very troublesome. And this is really what's happening here, as I was alluding to before. The issue here is what has happened in the last 15 years, the massive changes that have really impacted the positions of these leading economies in the EU and the US and Japan, and the growth of the rest of the world. So now you're starting to see kind of China and the rest of the world reacting to what they perceive is kind of high-handed attitudes and actions by these former #1 economic powers.
Now, Saruhan, do you find it strange? We see that the global community has spent the better part of basically 2 decades advocating for and promoting this interconnected trade and globalization. So if we're now seeing a shift in the other direction, what does that mean then for consumers and for businesses?
Well, it could be a couple of things, but before that, they spent, about 20 years going for this. But if they spent half the time in trying to look at how this global pie that got bigger could be equitably distributed among other players, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in right now. But in short term, Rachelle, we are definitely going to have some kind of an impact on consumption and business as well. But depending on what business you are, some business in retail especially, they have a global supply chain. They're definitely going to be affected by it. But in the US, if you're talking about manufacturing, oil and coal, infrastructure, construction, these industries will be short-term beneficiaries from that. Country-wise, in the short term, you're not going to see a lot of difference here. But Mark Twain once said, a man learns holding a cat by its tail, something that he would learn in no other way. We're in uncharted territory. There's going to be some scratches, that's for sure.
Indeed, and as Saruhan was mentioning, some of the industries most likely to be affected. Einar, what do you see as really some of the biggest winners and losers in this scenario?
Well, I think the biggest loser is the entire world. I think any kind of trade protectionism is going to start unraveling a lot of the progress that is made in the last 15 years. And, you know, at one sense, we're looking at a world that is less stable than it appeared 15 years ago. But on the other hand, you've seen a much more equitable distribution of growth, which was absolutely necessary and was one of the primary goals, at least, that was said by the West when they began this idea of creating a world economic unit, something that worked much, much better. I think part of it is the ideological component. A lot of people in the West assumed that there would be this kind of end of history approach, that Western liberal democracy and capitalism would go hand in hand. Now, what they've seen are different models that are arising, especially with China. And this has been kind of threatening, along with the economic side and the consequences of this and the rise of the political disjointedness. It's had an impact.
Now, Saruhan, as we look at some of the potential compromises that could arise, because at the end of the day, the US and China, nobody wants to see a trade battle. If a compromise could be reached, what would it look like?
Well, not about necessarily MES, but look, to be honest with you, I think Chinese leaders are kind of happy with the election result, because Hillary Clinton and her global ideology approach to trade is not one that fits to China's idea. Right? Now here, we do have some common grounds. Look, infrastructure. We know that the United States is going to get engaged in heavy infrastructure spending. Well, guess what? Who did it? China did it, and China did it well. China is also heading AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Donald Trump is a businessman. He wants to get loans at low interest rates and spend it on infrastructure. Why not? Why not a possible Chinese invitation for the US to the AIIB? I'm not ruling this out. Politics. Both countries want strong sovereign states because they realize that non-state actors cause a lot of problems, ISIL and spread of all kinds of different organizations. Right. And there's a possible cooperation there as well because both countries understand that they need to work together to kind of minimize the impact of those actors.
Well, the world will certainly be watching to see how this all plays out. Thank you so very much, Saruhan Hatipoglu and Einar Tangen.